I played the original Silent Hill 2 over a year ago and was blown away with how good the game looked for something that came out in 2001. I was mesmerized by the atmosphere, the tone, and the unease that I felt while exploring the abandoned town. It quickly became one of my favorite games of all time. I also made a video on it which you can check out, links in the description. Anyway, in this video we'll be looking at the recently released Silent Hill 2 remake and how it compares to that of the original. In this video we will be having rounds where we will be looking at certain aspects of both the original and the remake and seeing which version does it better. We'll be giving each respective version points if they win that round. The version with the most point wins. Of course, this video will be mainly based on my subjective opinion and there might be a little bias involved, so don't say I warned you in case you get pissed off in the comments. Also, this video will contain spoilers from both the remake and the original version of the game, so I advise you to click off this video if you haven't played either of these games. But if you have, sit back, relax and enjoy this video. Like and subscribe if you do. And without further ado, let's get this battle started. Visually speaking, of course, a lot of people would say that the remake is superior. And yeah, it does look visually gorgeous. The remake does a great job at recreating and recapturing the feel of the town of Silent Hill. The thick fog effects looking over town look pretty eerie and disturbing and elevates the sense of fear and that you're not alone in this town. The one thing that I found really impressive are the wet puddle effects on the road. It really makes the game a lot more immersive. Another thing that they added in the remake were storms, especially during tense portions of the game. It really does a good job at elevating the suspense and horror to the game. My major complaints with regards to the visuals of the remake, however, is that the hair effects look a little shit, to be honest. Especially James's hair. It looks a bit like clay and out of place compared to the rest of his character model. Other than that, most of the character models in the game look pretty decent, but compared to the original, I would say that the only characters that look much better in the remake are Eddie and Angela. The reason why I much prefer Eddie in the remake is because he looks a lot more intimidating and unsettling. In the original game, he just looked a lot more goofy and hard to take seriously. Angela also looks like a teenager as she was originally meant to be like, unlike looking like a middle-aged woman in the original, which was just weird. Other than that, I much prefer the way James, Laura and Maria look in the original. Sorry guys, Maria looks sexier in the original. But I would give Bloober Team props for polishing up the character models as they looked quite weird and janky from the trailers. Overall, the remake does look better, obviously, so it easily wins this round and gets a point. But let's not undermine how good the original looked for its time. Especially playing it just a year back, I really couldn't believe that it came out back in 2001, which is really impressive. Now, one of the main things that the original Silent Hill 2 really excelled in was its intricate level design, especially with its well thought out puzzles that you're supposed to solve by finding items scattered across the area. Finishing these makes you progress to the next main area in the game. And that's how the general gameplay loop works even in the remake. The remake does change things up quite a bit, whilst keeping some of the more iconic puzzles intact and adding its own spin on it. Firstly, we have a completely new puzzle involving a jukebox at Neely's bar, which involves going to the music store and using pieces of a vinyl record and fixing it up to put it inside the jukebox. It's a nice little addition to the game and the piece of music that plays after solving that puzzle is simply beautiful. The Wood Creek apartment section also has quite a few differences from the original, with the inclusion of the locked safe room puzzle. However, the coin puzzle from the original is still there and mostly similar in the remake, and the places you find these coins are also quite similar. Of course, the way the apartments look isn't exactly one-to-one, and honestly walking through the corridors is a lot more terrifying in the original rather than in the remake, as there's barely any light and mostly darkness inside the apartment complex, which again makes you feel uneasy. In the remake, however, there's quite a bit of light, whether it be from the indoor lights or the light peeking through the windows, making it much less scary. But I would say that the Blue Creek apartment section looks a lot better and different from the original. It's a lot more decrepit and unsettling, which is why I very much like this area in the remake. We also have the return of the clock puzzle from the original, although it is slightly more extended where you're supposed to go to different rooms to collect the clock hands. As much as I do like this puzzle, I'm not really a fan of how much longer it is made in the remake, as it does affect the pacing quite a bit. The Brookhaven Hospital is also completely redone and restructured in the remake, with lots of new puzzles and some variation of the old ones. The bracelet and the safe puzzle are completely new, and so is the swimming pool area and the garden too. I like what they did with the hospital in the remake and the way the level is designed and how the puzzles are structured. But I'm sorry, I much prefer the hospital section in the original game. I remember feeling more spooked out and disturbed by the hospital in the original, and the puzzles were much better thought out. It really did a much better job at capturing it as a decrepit and worn out institution. I also think that this section was a lot more dragged out in the remake, which is one of the bigger criticisms I have about the remake, as at points it does feel a little bloated. It's still better than most 30 to 60 hour games nowadays, but I still have to call out the flaws that I didn't like. Now let's talk about the iconic descent down the historical society, and I'm glad they kept it the same in the remake, as this was quite an iconic section and I loved how it uses sound to trick the gamers into thinking that someone or something is approaching. They also kept the pit section where you struggle to find a way through, and also the locked trap room puzzle filled with insects. Since the underground tunnel area is mostly similar to the original, I don't really have much to compare, since both of them do this area quite well, but I would say that I like the fact that the pit is completely dark in the remake, which adds to the horror. In the original, it was just very well lit up for some reason, and it didn't make any sense for light to be there in the first place. Getting to the Toluca prison bit, I have to say I was quite underwhelmed with this area in the remake. Could be due to the reason that I was expecting it to be much more scary. Don't get me wrong, I do think that the mannequins crawling on the wall did creep me out quite a fair bit. But what I liked about the Toluca prison in the original was that the atmosphere of the prison alone was so terrifying, and you pair that up with a fixed camera, it does elevate the suspense quite a bit. There's also creepy noises that you can hear throughout this level from the prison cells, which I think was definitely a big strength of the original, that it could make you shit your pants without overly relying on throwing a horde of monsters at your face like the remake does. The puzzles are also slightly disappointing and much more easy to finish in this section. They also removed one of the puzzles that involved using tablets to execute a man, and they replaced it with the gallows puzzle, which appears later in the labyrinth section. They probably did this to avoid repetition because both of these puzzles are quite similar to each other, as both of them are based on an execution. But I still miss the disturbing noise of a man being killed to death after beating that puzzle, which I really liked. I know I'm quite mentally screwed up in the head to enjoy a thing like this, and I really need some help. Lastly, I would touch upon the labyrinth and hotel sections of the game. The labyrinth is much better done in the remake. In this section, we get these creepy monsters crawling the railings underneath. The remake does a much better job at utilizing them more, as they were barely used in the original, especially in the section where you're trapped in a room with the two of them. Anyway, the Rubik's Cube puzzle also makes a return from the original with a slight variation, as it is a massive block which interconnects different rooms, stairways, and doors together, unlike just being a simple cube to solve. Also, you can pick up Pyramid Head's big ass sword just like in the original, and I do like that there is an actual use of it in the remake, as you have to use it to push away those weird and creepy creatures blocking the path. I do think that it's very cumbersome and annoying to carry this big thing, as it really slows you down significantly, and a slightly wrong button press and James turns back all the way, which is pretty frustrating. But I do like that there's a minor use of this weapon, unlike being totally useless in the original. The hotel section in the remake is more or less similar, but the layout is quite different, and I really like the way that the hotel looks. Like I would totally go here for a vacation alone, just me and the monsters vibing in my room. The music box puzzle also makes a return from the original. We also have the famous elevator where we can't carry any of our items with us, making a return. The things that are different though is that there's a boss fight involving the ceiling crawling monster, and there's also a small stealth section with these monsters. I wasn't too big a fan of these, to be honest, as instead of adding stuff of value to the game, it only dragged out its length more, which does suck. There are new puzzles here too, which I'm not gonna lie were super easy and not that fun to solve, which leads me to say that most of the puzzles in the Silent Hill 2 remake are quite underwhelming, maybe because I already played through some of them in the original, but the new ones that are added are piss easy to solve. Of course, I do believe things would be very different if I played the game on a much higher difficulty, but in the original Silent Hill 2, even in the normal difficulty, I struggled to solve some of these puzzles, and they were a lot more well designed and thought out in my opinion. And I actually had to look up some of the puzzles, and I know that I shouldn't have done that, but I'm a dumbass sometimes who makes stupid decisions, like forgetting to buy toilet paper and realizing that whilst I'm in the middle of taking a massive shit. I do think that the later half of the hotel is much better handled than the remake, as the destroyed hotel is much better animated and designed with the logs and structures falling off, and really the whole place coming apart. In the original, you can only see rundown walls, and not as much detail, which makes sense as it was a game from the early 2000s. It's hard to tell which version does the hotel section better, as visually speaking the remake does a much better job at capturing the peaceful hotel which later goes down in turmoil, but in terms of actually playing through it, I had much more of a fun time playing through the hotel section in the original, because I felt that it was much better paced and I had more fun exploring and finding items to solve the puzzles. Overall, this is a tough battle, as both the remake and original clearly have their strengths when it comes to level design. Ultimately though, I would say that the original wins this round, primarily because it manages to create an atmosphere with these levels that is really hard to mimic. It somehow makes you feel uneasy and uncomfortable without throwing a horde of monsters at your face, like I said, and it also has some pretty challenging and well thought out puzzles that take a bit of thinking to solve. The remake does have some cool looking areas, but it's only brought up by the good looking visuals and not because it cleverly uses its level design to establish a sense of dread into the player. So I would say the original wins this round. Before moving on to the next round, I also want to point out that in the remake you can find places of interest that pay homage to the original game, as the screen completely freezes and looms over the area, giving the fans of the original game like me a nice trip down memory lane. It's a really nice touch and I love that they did it. The general gameplay of both these games work pretty similarly, where you're supposed to explore the area to find key items that help solve puzzles, so you can progress to the next area. Now the major difference with these two versions is the original game has a fixed camera, and the remake does not, which honestly is better since I was never a fan of the fixed camera, as it can be quite finicky at times. One major complaint that I had with the original game especially was that the monsters were fairly easy to kill. They weren't as intimidating or much of a challenge for that matter. However, the remake addressed this, as the monsters feel a lot more intimidating and stronger in the remake compared to the original, and you also encounter them much more often, which keeps you on your toes, and also sometimes it is wise to avoid them, as you would run out of ammo too. The mannequin monsters in the remake are also probably the toughest to take out, as they can literally dodge your bat swings and literally jump at you. Another cool yet disturbing detail that I noticed in the remake was that you can hear sounds of a woman struggling and in pain whilst killing the mannequin monster. These screams can also be heard when killing the nurse monsters, which really adds to the messed up and twisted world of Silent Hill, and really does a very good job at making us feel disturbed. What I also like is that you have several new types of monsters too, like the enemy that can explode after being killed, which you gotta be wary of. Another thing that the remake improves significantly from the original are the boss fights. Like most of the bosses in the remake feel a lot more intense and chaotic than the original. In the original, for example, the boss fights just felt quite cumbersome as you're stuck in a small room for most of it, and it's annoying to find space to move around. The one thing that I would give Bluebird Team credit for is that it has definitely improved the design of these bosses, and they are much more fun to fight in the remake. Sure, they aren't the same level as some of the bosses you fight in the recent Resident Evil games, but it's quite an improvement nonetheless. Firstly, we have the first Pyramid Head boss fight and the Flesh Lip boss fight in the hospital. I really like that these boss fights utilize the use of space and destructive environments. They also feel a lot more grander in the remake than the original. The boss fight that is by far my favorite in the remake though was the Abstract Daddy boss fight, as not only does it have an intense set piece with the boss chasing you down and the building walls falling apart, it also adds more context as to how Angela's dad used to abuse her through the TV recordings, which really adds more narrative weight and explains the meaning behind Angela's behavior throughout the game. The Eddie boss fight is more or less the same with some variation in the remake. This boss is just whatever, I guess. It wasn't that great in the original either in my opinion, but I do think it's better in the remake as Eddie actually looks pretty freaking creepy in the remake. I was a tad bit disappointed with the last two bosses in the game, which involve the two pyramid heads and Mary or Maria depending on the ending you get, as he didn't really do anything different with it, as it's exactly like the original. Sure, they slightly extended the final boss to have 3 stages where you fight it underground, but it didn't really blow me away that much. Especially after playing through the rest of the bosses in the game, it's a shame as even in the original I thought the final boss was quite disappointing, and I would say the same about the remake. So the remake clearly wins the round for the gameplay and gets 1 point, more specifically for its combat, as it does challenge the player a lot more than the original, as there was quite a few times I died just in the normal difficulty compared to the original. Now let's move on to the next round. Now the main story of both versions of the game are pretty much the same, with the addition of new scenes in the remake. Firstly, I like to touch upon the voice acting performances of each character. And for the most part, I was fairly impressed with most of the performances. The ones that blew me away were Angela and Maria's performance. Maria's voice actress does such a great job at making the character look seductive and charming. I mean, she rizzed me up with her touch alright. Even Angela is pretty well performed in the game, as the way she speaks and reacts resembles that of an awkward and scared teenager. The voice acting for Angela in the original for the most part just feels hollow and very odd, but in this game they did a really good job at humanizing the character. Although I have to say that Laura's acting in the remake is quite disappointing. I didn't think there was much emotion to her lines, especially during the scene when she finds out that James killed Mary. Her acting is much better in the original, in my opinion. Now let's talk about the story itself and compare some of the memorable scenes between the original and the remake. Starting with the iconic introduction of the game. The remake does a decent job at it, but there's something about the intro of the original game that just hits different, man. The music and the wide camera pan shot looking over James and the town just culminates and hits you right in the feels, which I felt was really lacking in the remake. In the remake, the camera just follows James closely, which is quite a bit disappointing, as it is a missed opportunity at showing the dense environment of this game. Even the walk in the forest that follows after the intro is handled much better in the original, as I felt really uneasy walking through the forest as I could literally hear footsteps at one point. The original just makes it a lot more spooky, yet the walk in the remake just feels forgettable in my opinion. Following that, we get the conversation between James and Angela. Now I know this game looks absolutely gorgeous, but the first cutscene with Angela in the remake just feels a little off to me. Maybe because the original game's cutscenes were pre-rendered and looked a lot more cinematic, whilst the cutscenes are mostly in-game in the remake. The pre-rendered cutscenes in the original game just felt a lot more artsy and creative, whilst the remake just looks a bit flat, even though it's more realistic. Which is why I would say the art direction of the original game plays a huge role in making it stand out more. Our first encounter with the monster in the remake is slightly changed. Instead of being under the bridge, you encounter it inside a building. Both the scenes work great in my opinion to capture the sheer terror of these creatures. Now getting to the biggest sin that the remake commits is by removing the scene of Eddie eating the pizza in the bowling alley. I really don't know why they did that. Yeah, I get that it was a bit silly and goofy, but I like that it lightened the mood of the game up a bit and gave me a good chuckle. This might be a subjective take, but that was easily the best scene in gaming history, and you're wrong if you disagree with me. The remake replaced that scene with Eddie eating popcorn in the theater. The movie theater is a completely new section in the remake. I mean, it's alright, it only shows up for a small part of the game, but I felt like the bowling alley scene with Laura and Eddie in the original was way better followed by the funny retort by James. It just felt a lot more coherent and less dragged out than it is in the remake. They also extended the scene between the park and the hospital in the remake by giving us more dialogue and cutscenes with Maria, which I quite like as it fleshes out her character a lot more than the original. The scene that was quite shocking in the original game was when you and Maria are being chased by Pyramid Head, and unfortunately Maria gets the short end of the stick. Huh, get it? 'Cause she gets stabbed? I really need to work on my fucked up sense of humor. But this scene really hit hard in the original and left me speechless. However, the remake lacks the same impact in my opinion, mainly because it moves on too quick to the next moment. What I liked about the original is that it still gives some time for the player to really digest what just happened. It also does a great job at showing the immense guilt that James feels for her death. Yet the remake fails to do that, and it really cheapens quite a big moment in the game, as it feels like Maria's death had no impact whatsoever. We also have an additional scene with Angela in the remake, when we find the wrench and head to the park. I like this scene a lot as it adds more context as to what went wrong with her and why she is traumatized from all the abuse. So when James asks her about Laura, a little girl, which terrifies her, maybe because that's what her dad used to say when she was looking for her, when he wanted to do you know what with her. The scene with Eddie with the gun also looks a lot more creepy in the remake. In the original, the scene just looked sort of goofy to be honest, so it's good that they improved on it. Now let's talk about the iconic cutscene with Maria that plays when you're on the main menu for too long in the original, and also the story trailer for the remake. I do think this scene is well acted in the remake, but I prefer the original version over this, mainly because the pre-rendered cutscenes of the original and the weird CG models really give a weird and eerie uncanny valley vibe, which I think makes that scene all the more unsettling in the original. The reveal of James being the killer of his wife in the remake is much better done than in the original in my opinion, as it feels very dark and disturbing as you hear Mary's dying breath as James suffocates her to death. The last scene with Angela is also much better done in the remake. I have to give it to them. They really did Angela's character justice in the remake, and I'm happy that they did, as her story is probably the most tragic out of everyone in the game. Now let's finally get to the ending of the game. Initially I got the Maria ending, but I wasn't really satisfied with it. But I knew that this game should have multiple endings just like the original, so I redid the last two bosses again. Also because for some reason my recording software didn't record the first ending that I got from the game properly, so I had to go back and replay it to capture the footage. But the second time around I got the Leave ending, which although might not be as good as the In Water ending, which is the ending I got in the original game, it still leagues better than the Maria ending. The In Water ending will always be the definitive ending of this game for me, as it really suits the story of the game much better, as we know James is still a murderer and he shouldn't really get away with what he did. Although I have to say that I was a bit disappointed with the voice narration of Mary's letter in the ending, as it feels very stiff and not as emotive as the original. The letter in the original was much more emotional and hit way harder, and it legit drove me to tears. This one just didn't leave as much of an impact for me, which is a shame. The ending is just executed a lot better in the original game. Overall, I would say that the original game wins this round. I feel like a lot of scenes from the original game left a bigger impact on me. The remake does do some cool things that add to the story and make it better, but experiencing this story in the original was just way better. So since both the games are drawn at 2 points each, let's talk about which game is a better survival horror game overall. In this round, we'll talk about some of the things that I haven't really talked about yet that need to be in a survival horror game in order for it to be successful, and see which version does it better and give it extra points in order to determine the winner. Firstly, it's limited resources and the need for resource management. Now I'm gonna be honest, both games aren't really the best when it comes to this, as they both give a good amount of ammo, yet in the remake, since the enemies you face are a lot tougher, they take a lot more bullets, and I ran out of bullets way more often than not, which really created lots of tension and forced me to avoid conflict during some of the encounters with them and manage my ammo better. So the remake gets a point here. Sound design is another crucial component in a survival horror game, and I believe the original utilizes it the best, especially during the historical society and Toluca prison bits. You can hear some pretty unsettling sounds that really ran chills down my spine when I first played the game. So the original takes a point here. Lastly, a good survival horror game creates a sense of isolation and loneliness in the game, that you're all alone in this world and no companion or ally is there to help you out. Yet at the same time, there's this feeling that someone nefarious is there with you and could jump out any time. Both these games do a good job at it, however, I feel like the radio signals amping up that warn you of monsters nearby, elevating the tension, is done a lot better in the original game, as I could actually hear these signals more clearly on the original than the remake, really putting that idea into your head that you're not alone. The original also creates a sense of loneliness and melancholy through its phenomenal soundtrack made by Akira Yamaoka, who's a GOAT, man. Now I'm well aware that the soundtrack of the remake is composed by the same person, yet I feel that the music hits way harder in the original game and actually makes me feel all these emotions. Although there are some good remixed versions of the original soundtrack in the remake, it just fails to mimic the same vibes that I felt from the original. So the original gets a point here. And ladies and gentlemen, we have a winner. Now I know this might come across as biased. As much as I enjoy my time with Silent Hill 2 Remake, I think it's really hard to recreate that same experience that I had with the original game. Mainly because the original game was intentionally built for the PS2, so there were a lot of creative design choices that were made to avoid surpassing the technical limitations of that hardware, which gives the original game a certain charm and vibe to it. Silent Hill 2 Remake is still one of the best games that came out this year, and I had a great time with it, but I'll never forget what it was like to experience the original game in its entirety for the first time, and it's something that is really special and close to me. I hope you guys enjoyed this video. Like and subscribe if you did. This was a new style of video that I was trying to do, so I hope it's something that you enjoyed, and if you want more of these style of videos where I play both the original version of the game and compare to the remake to see which is better, please stick around. I like experimenting and growing as a content creator, and it would be great to have you guys around in my journey. Anyways, hope you guys have an amazing day, and here's me signing out.